Hi people, notes 4.5 are on solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula is going to look very scary at first, but I promise you it's not as bad as it looks. It looks scarier than it is. So for starters, we can only use the quadratic formula if we're given a quadratic equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So everything has to be all on one side and it has to be expanded out, and I should be able to identify what a, b, and c are. Okay, so here is the quadratic formula. X equals, and then I'm going to write a big fraction, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Okay, and I know this might look very scary, but I promise you it's not as bad as it looks. Just a quick note, we have learned how to solve quadratic equations by factoring, by completing the square, and lastly now by the quadratic formula. And this is just an extra tool in our toolbox to help us solve these quadratic equations. Here's a little song to help you remember this formula right here. And it goes to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So again, it's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Or you could also do it to the tune of row, row, row your boat. So x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, I bet you probably were not expecting a song in this video, but here we are. Okay, so how do I use this? Literally, all you have to do is just identify what A, B, and C are. And once you do that, it is nice and easy. You just plug the numbers in and then you chug out an answer. You're going to plug and chug. Okay, so the first thing that you have to do though is everything has to be on one side and it has to equal 0. So in this example right here, in number 1, it's negative 8x squared plus 64x. I'm going to get rid of the minus 72 because by adding 72 here, I end up getting 0, right? So I'm going to move this 72, this negative 72 on this side right here. So I get negative 8x squared plus 64x plus 72, and that's going to equal 0. Okay, and once I do that, now I just have to identify what A, B, and C are, and I'm just going to write on top here the standard form. So don't forget the A value is always the number in front, the coefficient in front of the x squared term. The B value is the coefficient in front of the x term, and then the C value is always the constant. Okay, and so all we have to do here is just use the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now every time I see an a, I'm going to replace it with negative 8. And every time I see a b, I'm going to replace it with 64. And every time I see a C, I'm going to replace it with 72. So let's go ahead and see what that's going to look like. Now be really careful here because this is negative and the B value is 64. So I have to write down that this is negative 64. Then I'm going to fill in right here that this is 64 squared minus, make sure that that square root is over the entire expression right here. So here I'm going to do 4 times A, which is negative 8. And then I'm going to do 4 times, then I'm going to do times C. I don't need to multiply by 4 again because I've already multiplied by 4. And this is all over 2 times A, which is this negative 8 that we have here. Okay, make sure again that your square root is all the way over. So like, for example, if you decide to just write your square root like this, it's not accurate. It has to go all the way to the end. So now I'm going to actually evaluate everything that is inside this square root right here. So I'm literally just going to type the whole thing into my calculator and get a single value as is. Now make sure when you type it in with brackets around that b value that's being squared. It doesn't matter if it's a positive value, but once we're looking at negative values, it is going to matter. Okay, so let's go ahead and type that whole expression under the square root in. And I'm going to do it without the square root button. So I'm going to type in 64 squared minus 4, and then I'm going to multiply that by negative 8, and then I'm going to multiply that by 72, and I end up getting 6,400. So this right here, this entire value that we plugged in will end up being 6,400. And that's all over negative 16, because I'm going to evaluate this as well, and this multiplied together gives me negative 16. Now I can go ahead, and if I'm able to do any square rooting, I'm going to do my square rooting. So just copy down that minus 64 right here. I'm just following BEDMAS, okay? So it's right here, this is kind of like I have brackets. I have to figure out what's under the square root. And here, this is like I have brackets right here as well. And now I have a square root, which is like an exponent. So that's the next piece that I need to do. And the square root of 6,400 is 80. So I get negative 64 plus or minus 80, and that's all over negative 16. Now I'm ready to go to my two separate answers. So one of my answers here is going to be negative 64 minus 80 over negative 16. And then the other one is going to be negative 64 plus 80 over negative 16. And when I do negative 64 minus 80, I get negative 144 over negative 16. And here, when I do negative 64 plus 80, I end up getting 16 over negative 16, which means that my two answers will be negative 9 and negative 1. So here, I can say here that my solutions are negative 9 and negative 1. Okay, in number 2, I get 17 equals x squared plus 5x. Now, it makes more sense for me to get rid of the 17 and move it over here than for me to move both expressions on the right side to the left side. So this time I'm going to have the 0 on the left side, and that is totally okay. And we should identify here that a would be 1, and I'll put this over here actually, that b would be 5, and that c would be negative 17. Okay, so same thing. I'm going to write down the quadratic formula over and over and over again until it gets stuck in my head. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now here, when I do this, I'm going to plug in a negative right here. This would become negative, and then I would have a 5. Then I would say plus or minus the square root of, and then here, this would be 5 squared, okay, minus 4 times a times c, where a is 1 and c is negative 17. And that's all over 2 times a, which is 1. And don't forget that you have to extend your fraction line as well as your square root line, so that way we can get a full, complete answer right here. So x equals, now here, this is still negative 5. I'm going to evaluate what's under the square root sign. So I'm going to go straight into my calculator and evaluate this. So I get 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 17. Make sure you have a negative 17 in there. Otherwise, it'll mess you up. And this would give us 93. So here I get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of, this becomes a 93. And then 2 times 1, I can also evaluate that, and I get over 2. So I can't square root 93 evenly. Let's see what happens when I try to square root 93. So the square root of 93 ends up being an irrational number. And the directions say to leave it as an exact answer. So I'm not going to go through and type this into my calculator and round, because no matter what, whatever number I write down, if I get it from my calculator, I am rounding, because that number would go on forever. Which means that my two solutions here would end up being negative 5 minus the square root of 93 over 2, or negative 5 plus the square root of 93 all over 2. So this right here means that my solution is this expression right here, and this, I call it an expression, but it's actually a number. And these are my exact answers. Exact answers are more helpful when we get into more like theoretical type of math, but when we're talking about like quadratic equations and stuff, it'll be more helpful to get exact or rounded answers, just so that you know. All right, in our last example, we're going to get rid of the 3x squared and put it on the left side. So this becomes negative 3x squared, 0 equals negative 3x squared minus 7x minus 11. So the first thing I want to do is identify what a, b, and c are. And we know a is negative 3, b is negative 7 and that c is negative 11. I need to use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to say x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now when I do this right here, be really careful because this b value is a negative 7, but this says negative b. And whenever we have a minus a negative, that turns into a positive. So this is 7 plus or minus. Now when we do this here, you have to make sure that you put that negative 7 in brackets, because if you don't, it's going to fully throw you off. So here I'm going to put in here negative 7 squared minus 4 times a, which is negative 3, times c, which is negative 11. And this is all over 2 times a, which is negative 3. Now, we need to evaluate this expression right here. And before we do that, I would like for you to please try it yourself and see if you get the same answer as me, because we got to make sure that you're able to plug these numbers into your calculator correctly. Okay, and here, when I do this here, I get negative 83, okay? So if I look right here, this ends up becoming x equals 7 plus or minus the square root of negative 83 all over negative 6. Right? Because I also have to multiply these two numbers together. And if I try to take the square root of negative 83, I get an undefined answer. I am told that it's not possible, which should make sense because there's no way that I can multiply a number by itself and get a negative number. If both numbers are positive, they give me a positive, right? If both numbers are negative, they give me a positive still. The only way we get a negative is if one is positive and one is negative, but then they're not the same number. So it's impossible to take the square root of a negative number. This here is impossible. What does that mean? It means that there are no solutions. And this right here, this symbol right here means no solutions. Okay? And I want to show you graphically how this would work for us. So for starters, I'm going to start with this one right here. I'm going to type this into Desmos with y equals. So here's our first parabola, question number 1. And we can see that this crosses the x-axis at negative 1 and at positive 9. Okay? Which are the solutions to this right here if we had just not made this mistake here, because apparently I forgot that a negative divided by a negative is a positive. I am very sorry about this. So it's positive 9 and negative 1, which lines up with the parabola that we have right here. Let's try the next one. So I'm going to type this into Desmos and I'm going to use y equals as well. And if you see here, this parabola will intersect at these values right here, negative 7.322 and 2.322. And if you remember, the answers that we got here were these two answers right here. So I'm going to type these into Desmos to see what these are as values. And if you notice, the values that are on our roots right here or on our x-intercepts are the exact same values that we got right here. When we round them. So this will also give us our answer right here. Let's take a look at our last example. And in our last example, I'm going to type this into Desmos. And if you take a look at what's going on here, I can see my parabola will never cross the x-axis ever, ever, ever. The vertex is in the negatives and it opens down, which makes sense why we would have no solution here. And that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you in class. Bye.